on Casten from the 6th Congressional District right here in Illinois. Congressman Casten, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. I know you don't have a lot of it, but to speak with us about this.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's start out with this. What does it really mean when we say government shutdown for every American out there? Are there any particular offices, agencies that we may not have access to while this is going on?
Well, so this shutdown is going to be more painful than most because we haven't gotten any of the appropriations bills done. Sometimes when you have these shutdowns, it's just a few agencies. It's also going to be more painful than most because the Trump administration has been cutting staff at so many agencies over the start of their terms. In the short term, most federal employees are told that you have to show up at work, but you won't be getting paid. That lasts for a little while, although that obviously gets painful. So for people like TSA employees who don't make a lot of money to begin with, that starts creating stresses on the system. You also then have a whole set of other employees who are told that you are non-essential and so don't show up at all. Among the ones that are deemed non-essential are people like in the Environmental Protection Agency who do disaster preparedness. So we're in a really bad situation if a major hurricane hits during a shutdown, if there's something else like the East Palestine crash. Layered on top of that is that the flood insurance program is no longer authorized. So if you get a hurricane and your house floods, that's a problem, and FEMA is just about out of money. Doesn't have to happen this way. It happened because the Republicans who control all chambers couldn't manage to fund the government. But hopefully we'll get through this quickly.
I'm looking at your statement that you put out saying that this week you were going to be in D.C. ready to vote for a government funding package that improves the health, safety, and economic well-being of the American people. And these are your words here. If Congress does not act swiftly, the government will shut down. We're here. Healthcare premiums may skyrocket, and millions of Americans could lose their health insurance altogether. Can you talk about that part of it? Healthcare premiums and also millions of Americans losing their health insurance. Are we there yet?
Well, so the bill that the Republicans passed, the big ugly bill earlier this year, stripped 11, 12 million people's health insurance away because of the cuts in Medicaid and the required cuts that come to Medicare as well because of the deficit ballooning parts of that bill. In addition to that, that bill did not address the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, if you will, and the tax credits that expire at the end of this year. However, if you are the beneficiary of those tax credits, your insurance company is required to notify you on October 1st, that's right now, that the subsidies will no longer be in place. So, just in the 6th district that I represent, there's about 20,000 people who depend on those tax credits, which means that their insurance costs, some of the anecdotes we've heard are people who are, going to expect to see their insurance costs double perhaps. And of course, for some people, if you can't afford the doubling, that means you just don't get insurance anymore. So the overall estimate of this is that probably something like 14 million Americans lose their health insurance because of the combination of the cuts that were already made in the big ugly bill and then those that will come into effect unless we deal with the ACA tax credits in this bill, which is what we were asking for, what the Senate was asking for as a condition of passing this CR. And ultimately, we were told to pound sand, and so the Senate didn't get it passed, and so now we wait.
And right now is when all of the finger pointing is happening. Republicans saying, oh no, this is the Democrats' fault. And then we're hearing Democrats say the same thing. What's the issue here? Why is it that no agreement could be reached on this deal? What were some of the sticking points that you saw being problematic moving forward in terms of getting this done?
Well, so for context, I'm going into my 4th term in Congress now. 2 of those terms, the Democrats have been in the majority. 2 of those terms, the Republicans have been in the majority in the House. In the 2 terms, the Democrats were in the majority. We passed all the appropriations. We didn't get into having to do shutdowns because we did our job in knowing that there was a September 30th fiscal year, and we did that on a bipartisan basis because that was where the votes were. In the 2 terms that the Republicans have been in the majority, they have never passed a full appropriations package. And so all we ever do is go through these continuing resolutions. This particular continuing resolution, because it locked in all of the cuts that were done on a straight party line basis earlier this year, rather than going back to the last bipartisan agreement we had, it put us in a position of saying, are we going to vote to strip people's health care away? Are we going to vote on the assumption that maybe they'll put it back in and we should trust them in spite of the fact that the White House has refused to spend congressionally mandated spending, and Mike Johnson and John Thune have refused to do any oversight. And that lack of trust, that lack of a commitment by both parties of Congress just to defend the prerogatives of Congress, our constitutional authority to control spending, has made this more high stakes than it could have been. And of course, was compounded by the fact that prior to this point, the Republicans had not managed to pass any appropriations bills. They control all three branches. If they'd passed some of those appropriations bills, the shutdown wouldn't have covered all of government, but that's because they couldn't get their work done.
I know you mentioned Speaker Johnson there, and in fact, in your statement, you mentioned him as well, saying that he canceled previously scheduled votes for this week, sending Congress into a prolonged recess at a critical moment. Where are we now with this? When will another vote come up again?
Well, it's worth just mentioning quickly about Speaker Johnson. Remember how he got his job. The last time we had a bipartisan continuing resolution, that was when Kevin McCarthy was the speaker, and the result of that was that he got thrown out of work because his far right flank revolted. So Mike Johnson only has his job because the Republican Congress passed a bipartisan continuing resolution. So he's basically decided not to do this. Um, the That's a choice for his part, but I think essentially you have to understand that he serves at the pleasure of Donald Trump. He's not independent. As we go forward from this point, the question of how we get out of this, we'll see. The Senate Leader Thune continues to bring the vote back up. I think he's brought it up now twice in a row. So far, it hasn't changed any of the votes. If they were to pass something out of the Senate, we would, of course, be right back on a plane because we'd have to pass it in the House. And depending on what would pass out of the Senate, we'll see where the votes are in the House for that. As of right now, though, Leader Thune does not seem to be inclined to negotiate across the aisle. They just keep bringing forward the same bill that had failed and hoping that maybe pressure will push something forward. I hope there's a better way through this. I hope it doesn't take some horrible disaster to get through. But I think that, the true nightmare scenario is we have something like the East Palestine train crash when folks in FEMA are not at work, when folks at the EPA are not at work, when folks at OSHA are not at work, and those crises become much worse than they would otherwise have been. I hope it doesn't take that to bring us back. I hope saner heads prevail before then, but right now the ball is really in the Republicans' court.
When you talk about a disaster happening, if that did happen under these circumstances, something like that was to actually happen, what would that look like because the government is shut down?
Really bad. The National Flood Insurance Program authorization expired on September 30th, yesterday. So if there was if Hurricane Helene, that came through the Carolinas and devastated all those properties less than a year ago, if that were to come next week, there is no flood insurance. The emergency funding at FEMA is essentially gone. So the resources that FEMA would have to come in and help isn't there. We need those resources. The personnel problems in many ways are bigger, though, because if you've got federal employees who are not getting paid and told that they don't need to be at work, well, that means that they can't come as quickly as you might. And when maybe you can find some way to remobilize them, how do you know that some of them didn't go and find another job because they had to pay rent? So the longer these things go on, the more difficult it becomes. If you shift away from disasters just to see some of the long-term threats, our air traffic controllers are all essential employees. They all go to work. The training program for air traffic controllers is deemed non-essential. Our air traffic controllers, the average age is pretty high. We need to bring that pipeline in. So if we don't get this done, all of a sudden we've got a huge shortage of the talent and the training we need to keep our skies safe. So there's big consequences to shutting this down. I don't know how many times I say this. We shouldn't have done this, but this is where we've ended up.
Congressman Casten, I know that you're still working for the people. You have a lot of work to do. So I will ask you this final question before we let you go. For everyday Americans, everyday people that are experiencing this shutdown, what will that look like for them?
Well, number one, everybody's circumstances are unique. Obviously, I can only directly help folks in my district, but if you've got questions, do go to our website, casten.house.gov/shutdown 2025. We've got a list of frequently asked questions there, and we're trying to just take all the questions we get from constituents maintain some answers there so we can go through. Um, Generally speaking, the services you expect will continue, but the back office isn't there. So, for example, the Social Security office is still open, but people who are going through to process that you had an overpayment and you need a refund due, you've lost your Medicare card. Those people are not working right now, so there's some limitations that are there. The uh, you know civil courts are no longer functioning. So if you've got some problem with the government or with an agency that you want recourse, you're going to have to wait to get that recourse. Those seem like small things unless it's something that really matters to you in the immediacy of the moment. But do call us, call your member of Congress, whoever they are, because all of us are pretty good at navigating those agencies and constituent services. But be a little patient with our federal workers right now. They're good people. They got into this line of work for public service, and they're pretty well starved for resources. And I just ask you, don't also starve them for respect. They deserve a lot of our respect and love for the difficult situations we're asking them to work in right now.